In this lesson, you're going to learn how to answer some of the most common investment banking and private equity interview questions on the topic of leveraged buyout models. The most common question here is just being asked to walk through a sample model. We went over that in the previous video, so I'm not going to repeat that here. After that, the second most common question is, why would a private equity firm want to do this? Why would they actually want to buy a company and then use leverage to make the acquisition? And the answer, as we've been over before in these videos, is that whenever you use leverage, you're going to boost your return. So going back to the house example, if you put down 500,000 initially in cash and then get back 600,000 at the end also in cash, well, in this case, it's not bad because you have around a 1.2x return. But if you could put down only, say, 200,000 in the beginning and then pay for the rest with debt, then it's much easier to get a higher return in this case, and the return jumps up substantially. So that's the motivation. A secondary factor here is that if you use leverage, you also have more cash available, more equity available to purchase other companies in your portfolio. But really the main benefit here of using leverage is to boost the private equity firm's return. Another question you can get here is, with an LBO model, we saw how a PE firm can use either debt or equity, cash in other words. Why is it that a PE firm would want to use more debt? Because we saw in a merger model that in most cases, all else being equal, and assuming unlimited funds, that a company would always prefer to use cash because the foregone interest rate on cash is lower than the debt interest rate, and it's usually lower than the cost of equity. So why is it that in the merger model, a company, the buyer, would want to use cash, whereas in an LBO model, the PE firm would want to use as much debt as possible? And the answer here is that they're buying companies for different purposes. With a merger model, usually the buyer, a strategic acquirer, another company in the same industry, for example, is buying the company to hold on to it for a long period. They consider it a long-term investment. Whereas with a private equity firm, they intend to sell it after 3 to 5 years. So it's to their advantage to take on as much debt as possible because it's going to boost their return and because they're selling the company after a while. So having a high debt load doesn't directly impact the PE firm as it would the strategic acquirer, for example. Another common question is, which variables impact the LBO model the most? So if we go to do sensitivity tables, as we did here, what are some of the variables that we would look at and what impacts the model the most? And I think the three most important variables are actually listed here already, which are the purchase price over on the left-hand side of these sensitivity tables, and then the exit multiple or exit price of the company, and then the percent debt. These three variables will generally have the biggest impact. Other ones that could affect things would be the revenue growth each year, so how quickly the company is growing, and also its margins, whether you're talking about cash flow or EBITDA or EBIT. Those types of margins also affect the model by quite a bit. Beyond these, you could look at things like debt interest rate on cash, depreciation, amortization, but to be honest, these 5 variables will generally have the biggest impact on a model, which is why these are the ones that you most commonly see with sensitivity tables. Another question is, what makes an ideal candidate for a leveraged buyout? So if a private equity firm wants to buy a company, how would they actually be able to decide which company is a good buy, what they should do, how they should actually buy the company? So the most important characteristic of a good LBO candidate is stable cash flow. And the reason it's so important is because when a company goes through a leveraged buyout, they're going to have a huge interest expense, and oftentimes they'll have a huge debt repayment obligation as well. So if their free cash flow on the cash flow statement is not stable, if it's variable and jumping around a lot, it's not going to be a good LBO candidate because it may go bankrupt, it may not be able to meet its debt obligations. So stable cash flow is most important here. It's also good if the company has relatively low fixed costs and high operating leverage. So low fixed costs, if a company has lower capital expenditures, that's also good because it means they can use more of their cash flow to repay debt. Higher operating leverage really just means that they have a higher margin to begin with. If they have a higher margin to begin with, once again, as they expand, that margin will presumably stay the same. Even if it goes down, it means that as they expand, dollar for dollar, they're going to be able to devote more of their after-tax money, more of their cash flow to repaying debt. Beyond those factors, another thing that PE firms like to look at is the valuation of the company. So if we go in and look at public company comparables, for example, if we see a company that is undervalued next to its competitors, which is definitely not the case here for Apple, but hypothetically, if we had another company that was actually undervalued, then that would be favorable as well. If the PE firm thought they were getting a good deal by only having to pay 80% of what it's worth or 70% of what it's worth, then that would be something else favorable that would encourage them to actually purchase the company. Then beyond those factors, there are a lot of qualitative things that go into an LBO as well. So for example, in many industries, you have cyclicality. So if the industry that you're working in is currently in a recession or is in a low period, and the PE firm knows it's going to get better in 5 to 10 years, that may encourage them to purchase the company. You see this happening a lot with industries like semiconductors, chemicals, for example. These both tend to be highly cyclical industries, so sometimes PE firms try to time the market like this. Good management teams also play a role. So if the management team is particularly strong, if they see an opportunity for turning around the company, that could be another motivation for some PE firms. So those are some of the characteristics they look at. Another question here, going back to one of the points I raised in the walkthrough of the model, is how do you actually adjust the balance sheet in an LBO? And this is something we skipped over in the basic version here, but basically the adjustments are very similar to what we saw in the merger model. What we do is we look at the seller's book value, we write off existing goodwill, and then we create new goodwill, we create new intangibles, and we may have asset write-ups, we may have deferred tax liabilities as well. So really the key adjustments here are pretty much the same for an LBO model and a merger model. We're going to be going into this in more detail in the more advanced LBO model, so you'll be able to get a better sense of that there, but really they're pretty much the same as what we went through in the merger model in case this question comes up. Another question here is what are the different types of debt that you could use in an LBO model to finance the purchase of a company? The two main categories, as we went over before, are bank debt and high yield debt. In general, bank debt appeals to more conservative investors looking for a safer investment. High yield debt is riskier and appeals to investors with more of an appetite for risk. The key differences between these, just make columns here to review them. So with bank debt, you tend to have lower interest rates. With high yield debt, you tend to have higher interest rates. Another difference that we skipped over the first time is that with bank debt, the interest rates are floating. With high yield debt, the interest rates are fixed. All this means is that floating rates change over time, so it can go from 4% to 5% to 6% over the years, whereas high yield debt, if it's 10%, it's always going to stay at 10%. This is something that we ignored in this model, but we'll be looking at this in more detail in the more advanced LBO model. Then beyond that, with bank debt, you have principal repayment. With high yield debt, you have no principal repayment. So everything is due at the end of the period. This is called bullet maturity. With bank debt, by contrast, you pay off a portion of the principal each year. Also with bank debt, prepayment is allowed, whereas with high yield debt, there is no prepayment allowed. So in other words, if there's extra cash flow available, you can devote some of it to repaying the bank debt. With high yield debt, you cannot do this. And then finally, with bank debt, you have maintenance covenants, whereas with high yield debt, you have incurrence covenants. Maintenance covenants relate to things like total debt to EBITDA, saying that it cannot exceed a certain level, for example. You could have EBITDA over interest expense, for example, and restrictions on that, whereas incurrence covenants are more related to one-time events. So CapEx, divestitures, acquisitions, and really restricting what the company can do on those types of scenarios. So those are really the two basic types of debt. And you can see that many of these differences are already reflected in our debt assumptions here. This is a topic that we'll go into more detail in the more advanced LBO model in this course. Another question here is how do you determine how much debt a company can take on? How do you decide how much should be bank debt, how much should be high yield debt? So with this one, what you should do is similar to what we saw in our valuation. You always want to go back to public company comparables, see what kind of debt balances they have. You also want to look at debt comps here. In other words, looking at recent issuances of debt. for similarly sized companies and see what kind of debt balances they've taken on, what kind of interest rates they're paying. And so that's how you would determine it in the context of a real LBO model or financing scenario. Another question here is what is meant by the tax shield in an LBO model? So oftentimes people say that debt gives you an advantage because there's a tax shield on it. So what exactly does this mean? Because we didn't really point it out explicitly in this model. All a tax shield means is that when you pay interest on debt raised in an LBO, that interest is tax deductible. So it gets directly subtracted from operating income to get to pre-tax income, and then you pay less in taxes as a result of this huge debt interest expense right here. So that's all that's meant by a tax shield in the context of an LBO. Sometimes people get this mixed up and they think that you have to have a separate line item or a separate schedule for this or something complex is going on, but all it means is that interest paid on debt is tax deductible. Interest earned on cash, of course, you have to pay taxes on, so it's no different from anything else. The only reason it comes up is that sometimes people point it out as one of the benefits of an LBO, but in reality it's not different from interest income or interest expense earned or paid on anything else. Along those lines, another question here is what is meant by the cash flow sweep in an LBO model? So this is another one where people sometimes get a little confused and they think there's something very complex going on. All that's meant by a cash flow sweep here is that when you have excess cash flow or excess cash laying around, you allocate some of it to repay debt, which is exactly what this optional repayment line item here is for in our debt and interest schedule. So there's not really too much to this one. All you're doing is you're looking at how much cash flow you've already used to pay off debt in a given year. If you have any extra left over that you can still use, then you choose to use that to pay off debt as well. Now this does get a bit more complex, the calculations behind it anyway, but now the calculations behind this cash flow sweep do get a bit more complex, so we'll be dealing with those in the more advanced model once again, but that's really the basic idea, that you're using any extra cash flow left over to repay debt. Then a final category of questions here is what happens when you have a dividend recap in an LBO model? And this is something that we pretty much skipped over entirely because we do not have a balance sheet here, so this one is very hard to illustrate. This is something that we cover not in the more advanced model here, but actually in the Yahoo model. So in the advanced modeling section, where we go into a very complex LBO model, we go into a dividend recap there. But basically the idea behind a dividend recap is that the company takes on debt and the PE firm receives cash. So literally what's happening here is the company is taking on debt, then taking the proceeds and sending them directly to the private equity firm as a dividend. Now the practice of dividend recaps tends to be somewhat controversial because it would be like if you went up to someone and said, hey, take out a loan and then give me all the cash that you get from receiving that loan. So it's somewhat controversial because some people think that companies are abused by PE firms doing this or exploited by PE firms. But the reason that they would do this is, once again, to boost their returns. Because when the PE firm uses more leverage, as we saw in our sensitivity table all the way here at the bottom, when they use more leverage, a higher debt percentage, their return is going to go up. Usually with a dividend recap, this takes place around year 2, 3, 4 of the leverage buyout, so somewhere in the middle of the range. And all that happens here, going back to our merger model and our balance sheets here, all that would happen with a dividend recap is that the dividends would come out of the retained earnings balance on the balance sheet. So that would fall, and then on the asset side, the cash would fall because they're paying out that cash to the private equity firm in the form of a dividend. So that's all a dividend recap is. We're not going to go into it in detail in this course because it's not too likely to come up in interviews, and it's something that you're more likely to see once you're already working. So it's covered in the advanced modeling module instead. So those are some of the most common questions that you can receive on the topics of leverage buyouts, LBO models, dividend recaps, and some of the debt-related terminology that we use throughout this model. So that's it for our basic LBO model. And in many cases, this is actually all you need in investment banking to analyze the feasibility of an LBO. Oftentimes at banks, you will do a very quick model like this without the balance sheet to see whether the numbers work at the very least. Coming up in the next course, we'll be getting into a more advanced LBO model that adds in a lot of the items that we briefly touched on here, such as all three statements, balance sheet adjustments, a more detailed debt schedule. And that model will be more appropriate for private equity interviews, for private equity in general, and anyone who's more advanced and already knows how to set up a basic LBO model.